The Yangtze River is a 6,300-kilometer-long waterway, making it the third longest river in the world. It runs through the heart of China, traversing 11 provinces, feeding the land, factories, and cities. But one day, the water receded. Its level dropped to a historic low, and the great river's bed became exposed. Where life had once teemed, only mud and rocks remained. Millions of fish died, suffocated by a lack of oxygen. And then the Chinese government decided to act. This is the story of how hundreds of millions of fish were released onto a drying land. But let's start with coffee. Let me remind you to do a few things discreetly while watching the video. In April 2011, a drought began in China. It didn't arrive immediately, but it quickly became the worst in half a century, since the Great Chinese Famine of 1959-1961. Back then, vagaries of weather, combined with socio-political changes in the country, caused the deaths of between 15 and 55 million people. But we'll talk about that another time. So, in April 2011, the middle and lower reaches of the Yangtze, where grain and fish are grown, became extremely shallow. Not only agriculture suffered, but also the fishing industry, which supported tens of thousands of families. More than 98.9 million hectares of crops were destroyed, and more than 1,300 lakes fed by the Yangtze River were declared dead. They were no longer suitable for drinking or irrigation. Around 5 million people and millions of livestock were left without water. It's important to understand that the Yangtze Delta is the country's waterway, dependent on for 100 million people and 40% of the entire economy. Therefore, when the river dried up, it had a devastating impact on everyone. 34 million people were affected, with 14.9 billion yuan, or $2.3 billion, in direct losses. Something had to be done about this, so when the waters receded, the rockets came into play. Authorities launched around 36 cloud seeding operations in the hopes of inducing rain themselves. And in some places, precipitation actually occurred, even exceeding 50 millimeters, which is considered heavy rain. But no real salvation came. That is, in places where the drought was less severe, the water restored life to the soil. But in places where the cracks had already widened, the rain was too light to remedy the situation. And in some particularly hard-hit areas, it didn't change anything at all. Sure, the soil became a little darker, the air fresher, but that was it. Even the clouds weren't cooperating. They were moving too fast or going in the wrong direction, and it's simply physically impossible to create rain without clouds. Meanwhile, meteorologists were warning that there would be no rain until the end of the month, and the temperature would reach 36 degrees Celsius. Another way to overcome the drought had to be found urgently. When it became clear that clouds wouldn't help, people decided to use something they definitely could control: the Three Gorges Dam, the largest hydroelectric project on the planet. The National Drought Management Authority ordered the floodgates to be opened and water releases to be increased by 10 to 20%. This may seem like a small increase, but the amount involved was 5 billion cubic meters per day of volume, equal to Lake Windermere in the UK. All of this was sent downstream along the Yangtze River to where the fields were dying without moisture. The solution was simple and effective, but the weather had other plans. In early June, long-awaited torrential rains descended on southern China. They continued almost non-stop, week after week. Instead of relief from the drought, a natural disaster struck the provinces. Water flooded Odessa's agricultural land, washed away roads, and breached dams. Landslides erupted in the mountains. Ultimately, nearly 700,000 people had to be evacuated, and over 100 died. This flooding was the worst in decades. The country hadn't had to deal with such a devastating natural disaster since 1955. Whatever the case, the water returned to the Yangtze. But too late. In total, the Yangtze River Basin is home to over 1,000 species. There are over 370 species of fish, over 220 species of benthic animals, and hundreds of species of aquatic plants. It's a whole world hidden beneath the surface. And the drought practically destroyed it. The ecosystem suffered not only in the Yangtze itself, but also in the numerous lakes connected to it. In the riverbed, where it was still possible to swim, the water reached only knee-deep. The boats struggled to move forward and often ran aground. Some lakes had dried up completely, and in places where water still remained, the depth was no more than a meter. The water was murky, warm, and smelled of fish and decay. Lake Shiyu, which typically held up to 10 meters of water, dried up almost to the bottom. The surface was cracked, in some places the fissures extending 8 to 9 centimeters. Dead snails, the remains of aquatic plants, and carcasses of fish lay between them. The spawning season was approaching, when the rivers and lakes would come alive, and a new life cycle would begin in the shallows. But the shallows simply disappeared. The lakes disappeared. There was nowhere to spawn. and the surviving fish had nowhere to hide. Along with the fish, birds also disappeared, particularly small migratory birds, which fed on the fry, and there were almost no fry left. Lake Pyeonghu, which had once seemed endless and misty, now resembled a prairie, a flat surface covered with low grass. And although there was hope for the water's return, experts immediately warned that this was not enough. The ecological environment doesn't recover in a single season. For these waters to revive, it wasn't just a matter of rainfall. The diversity of fish, plants, algae, and other benthic biota needed to be restored. These guys were particularly concerning. East Asian harbor porpoises are a rare freshwater whale species found only in the Yangtze Peninsula in China and are critically endangered. When they were last counted in 2022, the population stood at 1,249 individuals, and the 2011 drought, as you might imagine, didn't do them any favors. First of all, the drought caused the water level to drop sharply, and porpoises began washing ashore, unable to return. Plus, as I mentioned, the fish were no longer able to spawn, which in turn affected the porpoises. While they're generally capable of adapting to different diets, the river became almost completely extinct. It's hard to choose something from an empty refrigerator. To compensate for the losses, in 2011 China decided to release about 1.3 billion small fish into the Yangtze River. 1,300,000,000. An incredibly huge number. The goal was simple: to restore the river's fisheries lost to drought. The project was launched by the Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Development, along with 5 provinces: Jiangxi, Hubei, Hunan, Anhui, and Jiangsu. These regions, located in the middle and lower reaches of the Yangtze, provide the country with nearly half of all freshwater fish. The fish released into the river were primarily for species black and white carp, galaval, and silver carp. These species have been consumed as food since time immemorial, dating back to the Tang Dynasty 7th to 10th centuries AD. And to this day, they account for the lion's share of what the Chinese catch in the rivers. But in addition to these four species, more than 500,000 Chinese perch, small-scale yellowfin, and even a few pufferfish were also released. A total investment of about 300,000 yuan, or about $46,000 at the exchange rate of the time, was invested in the release. But it wasn't just fish that were returned to Yangtze. The next step was the replanting of underwater macrophytes, plants that grow underwater at different levels and help maintain its purity and balance. In total, about 9,000 hectares of various plants were planted, intended to restore the natural balance after the drought. The fact is that due to the falling water level, the river became overloaded with nutrients, causing algae blooms. You've probably seen what it's like. When the water blooms, the oxygen level drops, making it impossible to live in. Along with the plants, another 21 million mollusks were released into the water. They also purify it. In this sense, mollusks and macrophytes work together like a filter and a sponge. They absorb excess and filter what remains. Under such conditions, fish released into the river will have a much easier time adapting. But before releasing them back into the river, they first need to be reared. Let's look at how this happens using one species, the Chinese sturgeon, as an example. This ancient fish is becoming increasingly rare in the wild, so humans have come to the rescue. The process is fairly standard. Scientists captured wild sturgeons from the Yangtze River, began breeding them in captivity, and now it is the descendants of these fish, the second generation, that are thriving in captivity. For example, the Chinese Sturgeon Conservation Center in Jingju has a special house. It's round, 40 meters in diameter, and almost 5 meters deep. It's essentially a large room for large fish. Adult sturgeon can grow up to 4 meters and require a lot of space. Therefore, large fish are kept in large rooms, while small ones live in smaller ones. The young grow in stages. At first, the sturgeon are kept in small above-ground tanks, like in a hatchery. Everything is stable: their temperature, water composition, lighting, because grinding Chinese sturgeon is very delicate. For this reason, well water is used, as it has fewer minerals and a stable temperature. And only then, when the fish grow up, are they moved to open ponds, closer to natural conditions. This is called free range. The fish learn to live as they would in a river. But this is not the final stage. Before returning to Yangtze, the sturgeons undergo adaptation in a special temporary holding pond. The water is filtered directly from the river, allowing the fish to acclimate to their new environment. The water is oxygenated, and the sturgeon's behavior is monitored. In short, everything is being done to release the fish not just into the river, but back home. But even if something were to happen to the sturgeons, they won't be allowed to disappear. For species like the Chinese sturgeon, sometimes called the water panda to emphasize its importance to the country. A kind of backup is being created. This species has existed for over 140 million years, but human intervention in the 20th century severely impacted its numbers. To prevent the sturgeon from becoming extinct, several conservation programs exist. At their core, they are based on a kind of doomsday vault. It was created for seed samples, but here we have living creatures. One of these repositories is located at the Chinese Sturgeon Conservation Center, and the second is at the Triachalia Corporation. They've even launched a program called Noah to the Ark, the goal of which is to preserve the gene pool of rare Yanza fish, including sturgeon, of course. The Ark contains tissue samples, cells, DNA, and biological material to help recreate the species. The biological material is frozen in liquid nitrogen at -196 degrees Celsius, where it can lie dormant for years. But when the time comes for reproduction, it can be used, combined with eggs, and grown into a new generation. This is a backup plan in case things get really bad with nature. And things aren't looking good right now. After the massive drought, hopes were high, and tens of millions of individuals were reintroduced to the Yangtze. But it didn't help. Or rather, it didn't change the situation dramatically, because the fish in the Yangtze River were becoming increasingly scarce. The first warning signs came when fishermen began complaining that their usual catch was almost completely gone. For example, the yellow cheek, a commercial fish that had previously been common. The numbers also speak for themselves. In 1954, the catch in the Yangtze River was 430,000 tons, then it began to decline. In the 1960s, the catch was around 260,000 tons, by the 1980s, 200,000 tons, and by the 1990s, half that. In 2011, the catch dropped below 100,000 tons. The drought certainly played a role, and without the fish releases, the numbers might have dropped to zero. But the fact remains, the fish aren't getting any bigger. In 2019, experts recorded that not a single Chinese sturgeon, white sturgeon, or lake dolphin had attempted to reproduce. Paddlefish had not been seen for 17 years at that point. Today, this species is officially declared extinct. The Yangtze isn't just a river, it's a veritable gene pool. And this gene pool clearly needs to be replenished. So the Yangtze isn't being ignored. In fact, fish are returned to the river regularly, not just after a drought, but year after year. Since 2011, more than 70 million fish have been released in the Wanzhou region alone. These are not just rare species, but also commercially important for the entire ecosystem. The effect, incidentally, wasn't just environmental. People began to better understand why aquatic animal conservation is necessary. There's even a special anniversary date for it, June 6th. This unofficial holiday, National Fish Release Day, has been celebrated since 2003. And the date was chosen for a reason. It coincides with the beginning of the spawning season. The water is warmer, the fish are more active. This means a higher chance of survival. For example, in 2023, 850,000 rare fish were released into the Yangtze River from a park in Yibin. 9 of these species are endemic. Among them is the Korean sturgeon, which is protected at the highest level in China. Next comes the Chinese sucker, also an endangered species. Plus 2 more species from the carp family, Renegobia ventralis and Coreus gikinoti, are protected by the state, but slightly less strictly. To understand what happens to these fish after release, specialists implant special tags in them. This allows us to determine where they swim, how they settle in, and so on. But if something turns out to be wrong, adjustments can be made during the next release. In short, the fish are being returned to the water, but this isn't just a campaign. It's a way to preserve the river's biodiversity. Without him, the Yangtze River has no future. But stocking the river isn't enough. It's important that the fish returned to the river have time to grow and reproduce. So in 2020, China made a radical but necessary decision. Fishing was banned in the Yangtze River. Completely. Initially, the ban was implemented in 332 nature reserves and protected areas, and a year later, it was extended to the main branch of the river and all major tributaries. Fishing was banned for 10 years. This should be enough time for the population to recover for at least 2 or 3 generations. For example, the main species of carp only reach maturity after 4 years. Therefore, a seasonal ban is insufficient. Many consider this measure harsh. In the first month alone, more than 100,000 boats were impounded, affecting over 200,000 people. Incidentally, some of the inspectors now chasing down violators were former fishermen themselves, but apparently turned out to be very conscientious citizens and decided to enforce the law. The miles were simply taking advantage of the opportunity to make money. Who knows? But they have to patrol the river every day. There are also night raids with night vision goggles. There are even drones. In short, serious efforts have been deployed to enforce the ban because people continue to fish illegally and they have to be stopped. Unfortunately, waiting and hoping is useless. The Yangtze River is already on the brink. Overfishing, pollution, and the damming of rivers, including 3 gorges, have taken their toll. And if nothing is done, releasing the fish will be pointless in 10 years. But for those who fear people are suffering from a fish shortage, there's good news. The Yangtze River produces less than 1% of all freshwater fish in the country, so the ban won't affect the market. The river, however, is a different story. It's too early to talk about long-term changes, but there are already some positive effects. Population sizes, biodiversity, that sort of thing. So, a fishing ban is a solution that would have been necessary anyway. Moreover, harvesting turned out to be far from straightforward. Xinhua Daily Telegraph journalists who traveled to regions along the Yangtze River discovered that no one really knows how to properly release fish, what exactly the river needs, how many fish, what species, and how to do it all properly. For some reason, no one has any answers. But there are reports with impressive figures and huge numbers of fry released simply for show. In some places, it's tens of thousands of fish. In others, millions. In some places, they even released alien species that the Yangtze fisheries didn't need. Or they used the cheapest fry of the 4 main carp species just to meet the quota. Meanwhile, any body of water has a limit, meaning there can't be more fish than the ecosystem can support. Ideally, you just need to replenish what's missing. But instead, it seems everyone is just slaughtering fish as they please. Governments, private companies, volunteers, even random, yet very responsible individuals. There's no clear reporting, so it's impossible to understand how logging is affecting the Yangtze River. So, it turns out that some species could disappear because everyone simply forgot about them, while others will multiply at an alarming rate. The balance they so desperately wanted to restore will be upset again. And all because there was no initial research. The river was simply treated haphazardly. Now imagine if, amidst all this chaos, uncontrolled fishing had continued. Yeah, maybe a ban doesn't seem like the worst solution. Thanks for the like. See you soon.